Chapter 3. Major Instruments for Combating Environmental Degradation. A background. Concerted global efforts to checkmate environmental degradation began in the industrialized world because it has become clear to the North that much of the impacts of the industrial activities going on there were harmful to the common future of humanity. Woodbury and Cotton, 1991, 189. Thus individuals, groups, organizations and governments of these countries became more willing to collaborate among themselves and with others in addressing the problem of environmental degradation in particular. McCormick, 1995, 51-81. The effort began with the scientific world. Reports from scientific findings revealed that pollutant gases, sulfur dioxide, methane, carbon dioxide, nitrous oxide etc., have damaged the Earth's ozone layer. Oyeshola, 98, 34-37, and are producing greenhouse effects. A prediction on the dramatic changes across the globe was equally made. Sat Punch, February 24, 2007, 9. Consequences of environmental degradation include rise in the sea level, displacement of coastal dwellers, damaged agriculture and subsequent famine. All these could be disastrous to humans if they are not prevented from happening. Oyeshola, 1998, 30 ff. The efforts of the scientific world and environmental non-governmental organizations was instrumental in gingering many industrialized states to take action. Pollutant states in the North wanted to find solution to the problem unilaterally, but their efforts proved inadequate owing to the transboundary nature of some environmental degradation, especially atmospheric pollution. In the late 1960s, the issue of global warming started to engage the attention of some scientists who alerted the world that the global temperature is rising more than usual. They contended that it was not the usual temperature variation. The world received the alert with a lot of skepticism. However, as the study of the world temperature continued, the alert started to generate serious concern as more and more scientists started to point to evidence of the phenomenon. The situation was not that clear or generally accepted when the first Global Earth Summit of 1972 at Stockholm in Sweden was convened. During the conference, not much consensus was reached on some issues. For instance, about a decade after the conference, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency was still searching for the trend in gas emission. U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, 1987. Indeed, up to the 1990s, American Congress was still probing the uncertainties surrounding climate change. Simarsky and Bush, 1991, 465-466. However, the 1972 summit established the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP, located in Nairobi, Kenya, and mandated it to coordinate researches and results of further environmental studies along the line of global warming and ozone layer depletion. Major, 1989, Mann, Bradley and Hughes, 1998, Sonis, 1991 and Tolber, 1992. Accordingly, UNEP started to inform the world on environmental issues through its bulletin titled, Our Planet, United Nations Environmental Programme, 1987, Boyd, 1989, United Nations Environmental Programme, 1991, Sinclair, 1991 and Tolber, 1992. Further summits were held and protocols, conventions and treaties were ratified. At last, the world has now accepted that global warming is a reality and that the climate of the planet is undergoing a change towards hotter and drier conditions. Also, a conclusion was reached that human activities that had escalated the emission of greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide, CO2, were principal factors responsible for the global warming. Accordingly, it is agreed that the best way to freeze the process of global warming and climate change, or at least reduce its rate of progression, is by taking remediation measures such as the reduction in carbon emission, the reduction in carbon accumulation through the provision of carbon sinks, thereby achieving a low-carbon society, as well as embarking on adaptation measures to reduce the disaster that the effects of climate change may bring about. Furthermore, through variety of its initiatives, especially the Earth Summits, the international community has come to establish a symbiotic relationship among global warming, national interest and responsibility of nation states and the need to save the planet. It has accepted and affirmed the need to reduce greenhouse gas (GHG) emissions by 50% until 2050 in order to keep the change in global mean temperature within 2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial times. In order to achieve this target, it is imperative to develop low-carbon societies, especially in the developing countries, as they will account for more than half of the global population and GHG emissions by 2050. Along the line, treaties were signed, conventions were convened, and agreements were reached, leading to many initiatives undertaken globally and nationally. Nation-states, international institutions, NGOs, and individuals in the international system have contributed in no small measure to confronting environmental degradation. 8 major areas of the initiatives can be identified. These are by way of establishing instrumentality of treaties and protocol, conferences, international environmental institutions, international environmental law, environmental impact assessment, environmental education, United Nations principles and treaties on outer space, UN, 2002, and sustainable development paradigm shift. The principal Earth summits, conferences, protocols that took place include Stockholm Conference of 1972, Rio Conference of 1992, Kyoto Protocol, Conference of 1997, United Nations Summit 11 of 2002 in Johannesburg, Copenhagen of 2009, COP21 of Paris in 2015 and COP22 Bali, Marrakech, Morocco of 2017. 1. Treaties and conventions. Many international documents, treaties, protocols, and agreements exist that relate to the conservation and protection of the environment. There are also different articles in the Charter of the United Nations Organization, the African Union (AU), former Organization of African Unity (OAU), and many other international organizations relating to the duties of states to resist all violations of their territorial integrity. Similarly, duty of states to protect citizens and ensure their well-being is included in many international documents. Debeokelare Katran, 1992, 101 and Oyeje Wado, 1990, 18. However, the following treaties are specific and direct. It is also interesting to note the content of the treaties as they reflect the socio-political climate of the era surrounding each treaty. In general, the early treaties are conditioned by the reality of East-West relations as manifested in the concepts of arms race, detente and coexistence, spheres of influence and ideologies of capitalism and communism. Examples of the treaties in this category include Antarctic Treaty, Partial Test Ban Treaty, PTBT, Outer Space Treaty and Treaty of Tlatelolco. The latter treaties reflect the idea of industrialization, aid and grants, collaboration, cooperation, sustainable development, good governance, democracy and globalization. Some of these international regimes are Antarctic Treaty 1959. This treaty declares that the Antarctic be used exclusively for peaceful purposes. It prohibits any military activities such as the establishment of military bases and fortifications, the carrying out of military maneuvers or the testing of any type of weapons. Although subject to possible future international agreements, the treaty bans any nuclear explosion as well as the disposal of radioactive waste materials in Antarctica. The signatories meet at regular intervals to discuss matters of common interest pertaining to Antarctica. The treaty was signed in 1959 and by 1991 the treaty has incorporated a new clause that prohibits all mining exploration and development for 50 years and protects wildlife, regulates waste disposal and marine pollution and provides for increased scientific monitoring of the continent. Antarctica is considered as one of the global commons. Partial Test Ban Treaty, PTBT, 1963. This treaty was signed in Moscow on 5 August 1963 and entered into force on 10 October of the same year. There were 112 signatories including China and France among the 5 nuclear founding fathers. The treaty prohibits the carrying out of any nuclear weapon test explosion or any other nuclear explosion in the atmosphere, including outer space, underwater, territorial waters or high seas, and in any other environment if such explosion causes radioactive debris to be present outside the territorial limits of the nation under whose jurisdiction or control the explosion is conducted. Outer Space Treaty. The treaty prohibits the installation of any objects carrying nuclear weapons or any other kind of weapons of mass destruction in orbit around the Earth or celestial bodies or on outer space. The establishment of military bases, installations and fortifications, the testing of any type of weapons and the conduct of military maneuvers on celestial bodies are also forbidden. The treaty was signed in 1967. Treaty of Tlatelolco. This the 14th of February 1967 treaty which came into force on the 22nd of April 1968 prohibits the testing, use, manufacture, production or acquisition by any means as well as the receipt, storage, installation, deployment and any form of possession of any nuclear weapons by Latin American nations. In addition, but under Additional Protocol I, all intracontinental or continental states which have jurisdictions within the limits of the geographical zone established by the treaty undertake to apply the Statute of Military Denuclearization as defined in the treaty, to such territories. The countries in question are France, the Netherlands, the UK and the US. Also, but under Additional Protocol 11, annexed to the treaty, the nuclear weapon states undertake to respect the Statute of Military Denuclearization of Latin America, as defined and limited in the treaty or to use or threaten to use nuclear weapons against the parties to the treaty. Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, NPT, 1968 military use of nuclear energy manifests in around 50,000 weapons of mass destruction during this period in the arsenals of members of Nuclear Club, in their ships, submarines, aircrafts and in missile silos. They vary in ranges from strategic missiles of the range of 8,000 miles to tactical ones capable of 10 miles, Roger, 1985. Commercial proliferation is represented by more than 600 power and research reactors in over 50 countries. Associated dangers of the nuclear energy are radiation, hazardous and toxic waste, malfunction, sabotage and the diversion of the essential elements, plutonium into undesirable usage. This was the scenario before the treaty that gave birth to the logic that the more countries in possession of nuclear weapons, the higher the danger of nuclear war and degradation of the environment. Further, it was widely accepted that the solution to the problem of ensuring security cannot be found in an increase in the number of states possessing nuclear weapons or indeed, in a continuation of the nuclear arms race by the then nuclear powers. Action must be taken to prevent both, horizontal, the spread of nuclear weapons to countries not possessing them, and vertical, proliferation, the continued accumulation of weapons and the development of new nuclear weapon systems by the existing nuclear weapon powers. The treaty prohibits nuclear weapon states to transfer nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices to any recipient whatsoever. It also forbids the assistance, encouragement or inducement of any non-nuclear weapon state by nuclear powers to manufacture or otherwise acquire such weapons or devices. Non-nuclear weapon states are forbidden to receive or acquire the means of manufacturing nuclear weapons or other nuclear explosive devices. Consequently, non-nuclear weapons states undertake to conclude safeguards agreements with the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, with a view to preventing diversion of nuclear energy from peaceful uses to nuclear weapons or other nuclear devices. All nuclear states, particularly within their ranks, undertake to facilitate the exchange of equipment, materials and scientific and technological information for the peaceful uses of nuclear energy. In addition, they are to ensure that potential benefits from peaceful uses of nuclear energy explosions are made available to non-nuclear parties to the treaty. They also undertake to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective ways relating to ending the nuclear arms race at an early date and leading to nuclear disarmament. After a decade of discussions and speculations, the outline of a non-proliferation treaty was clear enough to warrant signing it into a treaty on the 1st of July 1968. Eventually, it came into force on the 5th of March 1970. The first to sign were the three nuclear weapons states of the US, UK and the then USSR, with more than 50 other nations following. Nigeria did sign. Gradually, the number of signatories rose up to 175. Seabed Treaty 1972. It was the growing interest in the economic potential of the seabed in areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction, and the dangerous consequences of the possible militarization of the seabed environment in the mid-60s that led to the eventual Treaty of Seabed in 1972. The treaty prohibits the implanting of any nuclear weapons or any types of weapons of mass destruction, as well as structures, launching installations, or any other facilities specifically designed for storing, testing, or using such weapons on the seabed and the ocean floor and in the subsoil beyond the outer limits of a seabed zone on any national state. The treaty entered into force on the 18th of May 1972. There are 73 signatories. China, France, Israel, Libya, Pakistan, Spain, Chile are among the non-signatories. The London Dumping Convention negotiations, convened by the UN International Maritime Organization (IMO), adopted this convention in 1972. There are 66 countries that were party to it. It outlawed dumping radioactive and other waste deemed highly dangerous into the ocean. An amendment to the convention outlawed dumping of all forms of industrial waste by 1995, while a ban on ocean incineration of waste was to take effect by the end of 1994. MARPOL Convention 1973-78, the most comprehensive and important of all conventions, and the first one to provide exhaustive guidelines for ship builders and ship owners to follow in order to actively prevent marine oil pollution is the 1973 International Convention on the Prevention of Marine Pollution from Ships as modified by its 1978 Protocol, MARPOL 73-78. The MARPOL Convention and its annexes also provide the main source for the international rules and standards for pollution from ships referred to in Articles 194, 211, 218 and 220 of the 1982 UNCWS. Under these articles, states parties to MARPOL must apply the convention not only to their own vessels but also to violations within their maritime jurisdiction. Under MARPOL, a ship owner is prohibited from discharging oil or oily mixtures into the sea unless certain criteria are met or an exception applies. Its main objectives are to eliminate international pollution of the marine environment by oil and to minimize accidental discharge. MARPOL conventions approach release mainly on technical measures to limit oil discharges. The discharge of small quantities of oil is still permitted but only if it takes place en route more than 50 miles from land and not in designated special areas where virtually all discharges are prohibited. MARPOL is no longer confined solely to vessel source marine oil pollution but also regulates other types of ship-based pollution including the bulk carriage of noxious liquids and garbage from ships. Air pollution from ships, including greenhouse gas emissions, is being studied with a view to making proposals for its regulation within the MARPOL 1973-78 treaty regime. UN Convention on the Law of the Sea 1980 to the 1982 UN Convention on the Law of the Sea entered into force on the 16th of November 1994. The convention is the only global agreement that provides comprehensive coverage of all aspects of the various uses, abuses and resources of the world's oceans. Brodos and Vatanov, 1994, 223. Its entry into force represents an important step forward in international environmental law, for it raises to binding treaty status the ideals of Principle 21 of the Stockholm Declaration and strives to balance environmental protection and resource management with the requirements of free navigation. Nanda, 1995, 657. The convention thus attempts for the first time to provide a global framework for the rational exploitation and conservation of the sea's resources and the protection of the environment, which can be seen as a system for sustainable development and a model for the evolution of international environmental law. Benny and Boyle, 1992, 252. The global framework includes the allocation of sovereign rights and jurisdiction over natural resource exploitation activities, the regulation of the offshore installations utilized to extract the hydrocarbon resources in the continental shelf and the legal regime for the maritime transportation of the crude products of such extraction. Other items of international trade and the exploitation by fishing vessels of the marine living resources of the oceans and marine scientific research activities. This convention was the first intergovernmental negotiating conference in which many newly independent, developing countries actively participated. Their participation was significant in two ways, namely, their arrival on the international stage further upset the already uneasy balance that had hitherto obtained between the two superpowers and their allies in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and the institutions of the United Nations system. The Group of 77, a group of developing states which now number more than 120, constituted a majority whenever a one-state, one-vote system was utilized to resolve stalemates during the negotiation process. Secondly, these states were generally united under a shared ideological aim in demanding for a new international economic order, an IEO. The new economic order basically called for an end to the perceived exploitative practices of the rich, industrialized countries of the North to the disadvantage of the poor, developing countries. It calls for the restructuring of global economic and trade relations to reflect the above goal and the redistribution of wealth through transfer of technology and resources. The 1982 convention represents the first major undertaking among states to protect the world's oceans in their entirety against all potentially polluting maritime activities as opposed to the largely piecemeal, regional and specific activity-related international law-making processes which had previously characterized developments in this field of international environmental law. The marine environment includes rare and fragile ecosystems as well as the habitat of depleted, threatened or endangered species and other forms of marine life, Article 194.5, and is thus not confined to the protection of economic interests, private property or the human use of the sea. Convention on Long-Range Trans-Boundary Air Pollution, LRTAP, and related protocols 1979. The 1979 Geneva Convention for the Control of Long-Range Trans-Boundary Air Pollution, LRTAP, which entered into force in 1983 with the outcome of protracted East-West negotiations in the wake of the environmental chapter of the final act of the 1975 Helsinki Conference on Security and Cooperation in Europe, CSCE. It was one of the first treaties to recognize the adverse effects of air pollution over the short and long term and is still the only treaty example of major regional cooperation in the prevention and control of transboundary air pollution that results in acid rain precipitation. This convention was concluded within the regional framework of the UN Economic Commission for Europe, UNECE, which covers the whole of the European region from the Atlantic coast of the former Soviet Union, the Balkan states and Turkey. UNECE has 54 member states, including the US and Canada. The first protocol to the conference is the Monitoring and Evaluation Protocol, 1984. It seeks to ensure the availability of adequate financial resources to implement the Cooperative Program on Monitoring and Evaluation of Transboundary Air Pollution in Europe, EMEP. It provides for financing the costs of the international centers cooperating within the setup on the basis of mandatory contributions covering the annual costs of the EMEP work program, supplemented by voluntary 30 contributions. Sulfur Protocols 1985 and 1994 is the second protocol to the LRTAP Convention adopted in response to evidenced widespread damage in parts of Europe and North America to natural resources, and historical monuments and human health caused by acidification of the environment from sulfur dioxides, nitrogen oxides and other pollutants from the combustion of fossil fuels. The 1985 protocol established a 30% club by committing all parties to a 30% reduction in their national annual sulfur emissions by 1993 at the latest, using 1980 levels as a base. The 1985 protocol requires parties to report annually to the executive body of the Convention on their national annual sulfur emissions, Articles 4 and 6. The protocol also provides for the use of the institutional organs established under the Convention. Nitrogen Oxides Protocol 1988 becomes the third protocol. It is more comprehensive and flexible than the 1985 protocol. It requires the reduction of total annual emissions. It introduces into international law the concepts of national emission standards and critical loads. The 1988 protocol specifically requires parties to stabilize their nitrogen oxides emissions at least by the 31st of December 1994, using 1987 as the basis. Article 2.1 must apply national emissions standards to both major stationary sources, such as power plants, and mobile sources, such as vehicle emissions. Article 2.2a, b, and c. The fourth protocol, Volatile Organic Compounds Protocol 1991, addresses the problem of volatile organic compounds, VOCs, which are mainly emitted through incomplete combustion of fossil fuels in the engines of on-road motor vehicles. In keeping with the developing complexity and sophistication of the earlier protocols, the 1991 VOC protocol establishes specific targets and timetables committing parties to control and reduce their emissions to VOCs. Within 6 months of the entry into force of the protocol, the parties are required to begin negotiations on further steps to reduce national annual emissions of VOCs. They must also cooperate to develop and control strategies, ensure cost effectiveness possibly through the use of economic instruments, and adopt measures and a timetable for achieving such further reductions, commencing no later than the 1st of January 2000, Articles 2.6 and 2.7. As in the previous protocols, parties are free to take more stringent measures. Article 3.1. The protocol also provides for exchange of technology, research and monitoring, regular reviews of its implementation in national programs, policies and strategies. Articles 4 to 7. Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer 1985 and its Montreal Protocol 1987. The 1985 Vienna Convention for the Protection of the Ozone Layer and its 1987 Montreal Protocol are a response to the increasing concern over the threat posed to the ozone layer due to emission of certain chlorofluorocarbons used in aerosols and refrigeration. It is recognized that failure to protect the ozone layer posed a threat both to human health and the environment in general. The convention confirms that the global environment has its intrinsic value independent of its utility to humans. It also admits as an early example of the 31 precautionary approach insofar as it was adopted in advance of firm scientific proof of actual harm to the ozone layer. The Montreal Protocol sets out specific provisions for the control of ozone-damaging chemicals while recognizing the legitimate needs of developing states. The international trade in endangered species of wild flora and fauna. There are 180 parties to the adoption of this convention in 1973. It is aimed to protect endangered species by restricting their import and export and trade in products made from them. It prohibits entirely trade in species threatened with extinction, as in the ban on the ivory trade imposed in 1990. The Basel Convention 1989. The Basel Convention on the Control of Trans-Boundary Movements of Hazardous Wastes and Their Disposal is intended to establish a global regime for the control of international trade in hazardous wastes and other wastes. The convention is very specific in respect of toxic waste disposal. The convention contains general obligations requiring all parties to ensure that the transboundary movements of hazardous wastes are reduced to the minimum consistent with environmentally sound and efficient management. It also reflects an approach premised upon the view that wastes should, as far as possible, be disposed of in the state where they were generated, known as the proximity principle. What has been achieved by the convention is a compromise which places three important and far-reaching restrictions on international trade in hazardous wastes.
First, the convention confirms the sovereign right to ban imports either on an individual, bilateral or regional basis, provided the exercise of this right to prohibit trade in waste is communicated to other parties through the Secretariat, Preamble and Article 4(1)(a). Secondly, the convention adopts the principle of minimizing the generation of hazardous waste and promoting disposal at source. Indeed, the primary obligation is to manage the trans-boundary movement of waste in an environmentally sound manner. Thus, trans-boundary movement is permitted between parties to the Basel Convention but only in circumstances where the state of export does not have the capacity or facilities to dispose of the wastes in an environmentally sound manner itself, Article 4(9)(a), or where the wastes are intended for recycling, Article 4(9)(b). Furthermore, recognizing the importing states' responsibility under international law for the protection of their own environments, the Basel Convention places on importing states parties an obligation of environmentally sound management, Article 4(8) and 3. However, the exporting state cannot escape its obligation to manage the wastes in an environmentally sound manner and must permit re-import if necessary, Article 4(10). Thirdly, the convention requires the prior, informed and written consent of both transit and import states, in the conduct of international trade in hazardous wastes, Articles 4 and 6. The basis for the requirement of prior consent is that a state's sovereignty over its territory places a duty upon other states using this territory not to cause damage or interfere with other uses of the territory. Article 4, Section 2 of the final draft summarizes the measures adopted to regulate toxic waste disposal. It includes: a. Parties shall reduce the generation of toxic waste taking into account social-technological aspects, Article 4 halves a. b. Ensure the availability of adequate disposal facilities within the country of origin of the waste, taking into account technological and economic aspects, Article 4 halves b. c. Minimize the effects of waste and manage it such that it will not affect human health, Article 4 halves c. d. The trans-boundary movement of waste shall be reduced to a minimum, if it is consistent with the sound and effective management of wastes, Article 4 halves d. e. Export of wastes to developing states where such imports are prohibited or where one has reason to believe that the wastes will not be managed in an environmentally sound manner, is prohibited. Article 4 halves e. f. Illegal traffic, without appropriate notification, without appropriate consent or with consent obtained through falsification, fraud, etc., has to be considered criminal. Article 4 thirds. The Bamako Convention 1991. The full title of the convention is Bamako Convention on the Ban on the Imports into Africa and the Control of Transboundary and Management of Hazardous Wastes within Africa. It is a treaty of African nations prohibiting the import of any hazardous, including radioactive waste. The rationale for the convention is that millions of tons of hazardous wastes are produced every year and these wastes pose direct threats to the environment and human beings due to its toxic, ecotoxic, flammable, corrosive and/or infectious properties. Therefore, the continent must be protected from the waste. Similarly, the objectives of the convention include the protection of human health and the environment from dangers posed by hazardous wastes by reducing their generation to a minimum in terms of quantity and/or hazard potential. It also aims at adoption of precautionary measures and ensuing proper disposal of hazardous waste and prevention of dumping of hazardous wastes in Africa. Lastly, African leaders believe that health and biophysical impacts of hazardous wastes will reduce welfare and economic growth, will
negatively hamper the environment and impair the ability of future economic growth and well-being of the people. Furthermore, they affirm that the waste will negatively affect sustainable development of the continent. Impetus for the Bamako Convention arose from the failure of the Basel Convention to prohibit trade of hazardous waste to less developed countries, and from the realization that many developed nations were exporting toxic waste to Africa. This impression was strengthened by several prominent cases. One important case which occurred in 1987 concerned the importation into Nigeria of 8,000 barrels of hazardous waste from the Italian companies Ecomo and Jellywax, which had agreed to pay local farmer Sunday Nana $100 per month from storage. The barrels, found in storage in the port of Lagos, contained toxic waste including polychlorinated biphenyls, and their eventual shipment back to Italy led to protests closing 3 Italian ports. The Bamako Convention, though broader than that of the Basel Convention, uses a similar format and language, only that it is stronger in prohibiting all imports of hazardous waste. The convention prohibits the dumping at sea of marine incineration and radioactive wastes. The convention was seen by African leaders as a strong message to the West that the African continent is not a dumping ground of toxic wastes. 12 nations of the Organization of African Unity (AU) negotiated the convention at Bamako, Mali in January 1991. It came into force in April 1998, and only members of the African Union can become party to the convention. United Nations Convention on Biological Diversity (UNCBD), almost parallel to the negotiation on the UNFCCC, was that of the Convention on Biological Diversity (CBD). Its main purpose was the preservation of the richness in species of flora and fauna, both identified and unidentified species. Species play important role in ecosystems functioning and resilience besides other known function like food, medicine, beauty, etc. The central objective of the convention is the conservation of biological diversity, the sustainable use of its components, and the fair and equitable sharing of the benefits arising out of the utilization of genetic resources. Generally, the link between biological diversity and climate change is in 2 ways. First, biodiversity is threatened by climate change, and on the other hand, poor management of biodiversity can affect climate change. The preamble of the Convention on Biodiversity emphasizes many international principles of the environment. The parties to the convention, conscious of the importance of biological diversity for evolution and for maintaining life-sustaining system, and that the conservation of biological diversity is a common concern of humankind, agreed to inter alia enact a common convention to preserve the Earth's biological diversity. State parties agreed to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause damage to the environment of other states or of areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. The jurisdiction of the convention was to extend to all state party national jurisdictions and for activities in areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. For such areas beyond national jurisdictions, state parties are to cooperate with one another. 597 Article 6 of the Convention provides for measures to be taken by state parties for conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity. These measures include, develop national strategies, plans or programs to achieve the objectives of the Convention, and in addition adopt conservation and sustained use of biological diversity. Further, parties are to integrate as far as possible and as appropriate the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity into relevant sectoral or cross-sectoral plans, programs and policies within their country. The convention enjoins state parties as far as possible and as appropriate to identify areas of biodiversity that are important for conservation and sustainable use and monitor them, especially those requiring urgent attention, then identify the processes or activities which may have significant adverse impacts on them and their effects through sampling. Article 8 provides for in situ conservation, which is the conservation of ecosystem and natural habitats and the maintenance and recovery of viable populations of species in their natural surroundings. They are to carry out ecosystem protection of natural habitats and sustainable development in the area for the maintenance of viable population of species in the areas and its surroundings. The states were subject to their national legislation to respect, preserve and maintain knowledge, practices of indigenous and local communities embodying traditional lifestyles relevant for the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity and promote their application. Also, members are to cooperate in providing financial support for such conservation of natural habitats. The UN Assistant Secretary-General and the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biodiversity highlighted that terrestrial and coastal ecosystems store more than 5 times as much carbon as the atmosphere, while land cover change and ecosystem degradation are responsible for about 10% of the total yearly anthropogenic carbon emissions. Therefore, sustainable management of ecosystems can lead to global and national mitigation goals. Article 7 of the CBD through avoided emissions and increased carbon sequestration further stated that biodiversity and ecosystems can be helped to be more resilient and adapt to climate change by reducing other human-related impacts on biodiversity that may halt ecosystem destruction and degradation, eliminate pollution, eradicate invasion alien species, sustainably utilize components of biodiversity, and to invest on ecosystem conservation and restoration. States were encouraged to continuously assess which group and ecosystems are vulnerable to climate change and that the impact of climate change on ecosystem needs to be monitored. Article 9 of the Convention made provision for ex situ conservation, which is the conservation of biological diversity outside their natural habitat by establishing and maintaining facilities that will ensure this. The Convention enjoins parties to integrate conservation measures and sustainable use of biological resources into their national decision-making and adopt measures to strengthen this. These measures are, however, to be economically and socially sound measures. Parties are to promote research for scientific and technical education taking into consideration the special needs of the developing countries. The Convention called for public education and awareness programs to be embarked upon by member parties to enlighten people of the conservation measures taken. This is in line with the international principle of public participation. The public can only participate when they are aware of the issues at stake. Article 14 of the Convention called for environmental impact assessment of projects that may have significant adverse effects on the biological diversity. Where any danger or damage occurs from the activities of a state party to either area within its jurisdiction or outside its jurisdiction, the affected state is to be notified and all necessary steps taken to minimize the damage. Hence, the parties are to have national arrangements for emergency response. Articles 16 and 17 of the Convention enjoin parties to facilitate transfer of technology and exchange of information on the issue of conservation of biological diversity amongst themselves. Parties are to provide financial support for national activities geared towards realization of the objectives of the Convention. However, the developed countries are to assist the developing countries in providing financial support for such activities. This mechanism is to be under the guidance of the Conference of Parties. Countries could make voluntary contributions into this scheme for the purpose of conservation of biological diversity. Generally, Biodiversity Convention recognizes the fact that the biodiversity is a common concern of humankind. This is to say that granted biodiversity is within national boundaries and subjected to a state sovereignty, issues concerning it concern all humanity no matter where they are, hence states are to always consider this in their actions. The main goal of the Convention is conservation of biodiversity and the sustainable use of its components. The bulk of the responsibility rests on national governments. They are to implement the provisions of the Convention, in accordance with its particular conditions and capacity, or as far as possible and as appropriate. The above phrase runs through all articles of the Convention that provides for obligation of contracting parties. The definition of sustainable use in Article 2 of the Convention is abstract and fails to provide binding standard of behavior. The definition declares how parties should act rather than how they must act in terms of the sustainable use of their respective biological resources. States retain freedom of action to take measures on economic and social aspects of forests, with the condition that result shall be the conservation or sustainable use of those resources. The CBD, despite its shortcomings, has laudable provisions for commendation. It foremost recognized biodiversity loss as a global environmental problem, hence it sees its protection as the common concern of all humankind. The CBD also acknowledged the interaction and interdependence of all species, hence all parts of the ecosystem needs to be protected. In this regard, negative impacts of human activities on other components of the ecosystem and biodiversity is to be minimized. It is to this end that the Convention for the first time advocated for environmental impact assessment on all projects that will have impact on the environment. This is very germane for projects like oil exploitation and its concomitant gas flaring that is presently rated as one of the major emitters of greenhouse gases. It is in this area that Nigeria is highly affected. Gas flaring has for years, since discovery of oil in Nigeria, continued uncombated despite government's policies to halt same. Finally, the convention is also commendable in its directive to countries that they develop a national strategy plan. Several countries including Nigeria did this. 2. Conferences. The 1939 Trail Smelter Arbitration between United States and Canada, United States v. Canada 19383, ONRIA, 1905, charted the course for eventual international regulation of the environment. It also established the principle of international obligations arising from transboundary air pollution incidents. Subsequent elements of environment diplomacy included the International Convention on Northwest Fisheries, the Declaration of Stockholm Conference, 1972, the Economic Commission for Europe Convention on Transboundary Pollution, 1978, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, 1982, and the Vienna Convention, Montreal Protocol, and London Agreement on the Protection of the Ozone Layer. Often many of the conventions and treaties evolved within the platform of international conferences. Here, 2 Earth Summit conferences of Stockholm and Rio de Janeiro are discussed. Stockholm Conference 1972. Apart from many environmental-related multilateral agreements signed before 1972, and the environmental revolution of the decades of 1960 and 1970, McCormick, 1995, the Stockholm Conference was recognized as the first step jointly taken by states in the international system to effectively curb the menace of international environmental degradation. The uniqueness of this conference was in its approach that sought to cover all areas of environmental problems that commonly face the global village rather than the former, which was only based on specific aspects of pollution, or just on a region. In order to address the environmental degradation comprehensively and clean up polluted environment, governments of the industrialized and wealthy nations wanted all nations and industries to agree to act together. The rationale is if 1 or 2 parties or countries begin serious cleanup operations, those few would be at a disadvantage because their industries would have to carry an additional and unfair cost in respect of the cleanup or any other expenses expended on the environment. Their services or products might become more expensive. Therefore, it was in the interest of both industries and governments to go to Stockholm to create a level playing field where all would agree to clean up and on any strategy to be employed. The developing countries that were later invited did not see Stockholm in that way. The developing countries wanted the status quo of their industries to remain, even with its inherent pollution problems. For them, the problem of degradation was and still primarily that of poverty. In order to tackle poverty, they were prepared to adopt Western ways to development and accept the environmental problems as part of the package. Only a few in the northern sector of the globe took notice of the problems of the South from the Southern perspective. Oyeshola, 1995, 1. It was in response to this general indifference from the North that Indira Gandhi of India insisted that, of all the pollutants we face, the worst is poverty. We want more development. At last the conference was held. The conference, tagged the United Nations Conference on Human Environment, UNCHE, was held in Stockholm, Sweden from the 5th to the 16th of June 1972, with the view to finding a common outlook and common principle to inspire and guide the people of the world in the preservation and enhancement of the human environment. Osman Sig, 1990, 874. It took the conveners of the conference about 2 years of preparation before the conference eventually started in June 1972. It addressed all environmental-related matters like uncontrolled rise in the world population, unsustainable development plans, depletion and destruction of irreparable resources and gross deficiencies harmful to the physical, mental and social health of humans. In order to tackle the problems effectively, the conference demanded the acceptance of responsibility for their major causes and commitment to finding solutions to them from citizens and communities, multinational enterprises and institutions at every level. The conference was also interested in establishing an international framework to promote a more coordinated approach to pollution and other environmental problems. At the end, the Stockholm Conference adopted the Action Plan for the Human Environment, which eventually gave birth to the United Nations Environmental Programme, UNEP, in 1973. The conference marked a turning point in the development of international environmental politics. It represented the first formal sign of increasing international concern for environmental degradation on a global scale. Previous to this time, there had been bilateral, regional and even global instruments agreed between and among states addressing specific environmental problems, but none of them had highlighted both the universal as opposed to specific nature of environmental degradation and the global as opposed to localized effects of such degradation. The conference adopted some non-binding instruments, namely, a declaration of 26 principles concerning the environment and development, an action plan containing 109 recommendations spanning 6 broad areas. These were human settlements, natural resource management, pollution, educational and social aspects of environment, development and the environment and international organizations. The conference affirmed the rights of the sovereignty of states over their national resources and their rights to development, that is, it established a close connection between environment and development and a resolution on institutional and financial arrangements. The 26 principles in the Stockholm Declaration reflected a compromise. This is between those states that indicated their recognition and concern over the mounting problems affecting the global environment and those that wanted the adoption of the declaration to act as a catalyst for specific international and domestic action, along the line set down by the principles within it. Sands, 1995, 36. The declaration was not in itself a legalistic document nor could its provisions be held to be binding upon states. However, it did represent a formalization in UN practice which is used only when principles of special importance are being laid down and the general tone is one of a strong sense of dedication to the idea of trying to establish the basic rules of international environmental law. Some of the principles that were agreed and the institutions and programs that were established had an enduring effect. The debates at the conference established themes and practices that would remain central to international environmental politics for the next 30 years and beyond. The conference attracted wide publicity and many of the participants and observers no doubt learned a lot from the discussions of a wide range of specific environmental issues. The most important contribution of the conference could be referred to as the Stockholm Declaration's principles, particularly from the point of international environmental law as enunciated by Principle 21, namely states have, in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the principle of the international law, the sovereign right to exploit their own resources pursuant to their own environmental policies, and the responsibility to ensure that activities within their jurisdiction or control do not cause damage to the environment of other states or of areas beyond the limits of national jurisdiction. This is in many respects the golden rule of international law for the protection of the environment and may be described as the starting point for the sub-discipline of international environmental law. It has been called the fundamental principle of state responsibility for trans-boundary environmental harm, entering in as it does the principle of national sovereignty while imposing limits on a state's activities where these inflict environmental damage to other states and to areas beyond national jurisdiction. Other contributions of the conference may include the following. It is true that some of the principles did not immediately command universal acceptance because the Soviet Union boycotted the conference for broader foreign policy reasons. Nonetheless, the agreed principles significantly strengthened the framework for the future environmental cooperation. Attention was called to the international community to determine limits on the use and abuse of global commons. Global commons are resources identified as the common heritage of humankind, such as the outer space, Arctic and Antarctic circles and the deep sea that should be collectively managed, preserved or used to common benefit, and that measures are to be taken to prevent pollution and protection of the natural environment. The conference led to the establishment of global and regional environmental monitoring networks which have improved monitoring of environmental problems such as marine pollution and ozone depletion and have indirectly stimulated action to tackle them. It also led to the creation of the UN agencies and the promotion of the integration of environmental considerations into their work. After the Stockholm Conference, attention shifted from environmental issues per se to its interrelationships with human activities, especially the relationship between human-natural environment, poverty and environmental degradation. The Nigerian Environment, Vol. 4, No. 1st of March 1992, 4. This period led to a proliferation of international environmental organizations and greater efforts by existing institutions to address environmental issues. Other areas were the development of new sources of international environmental obligations from acts of such organizations, new environmental norms established by treaty, the development of new techniques for implementing environmental standards including environmental impact assessment and access to information, and the formal integration of environment and development, particularly in relation to international trade and development assistance. Many governments subsequently created ministries for the environment and national agencies for environmental monitoring or regulation. It is also of importance to note the rise and spread of environmental non-governmental organizations, NGOs, such as Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth and the World Wide Fund for Nature, WWF, and the consequent part they have played in raising public consciousness over environmental issues at the international, national and local levels. All those activities and programs paved way for the major subsequent UN Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED, the so-called Earth Summit, in Rio de Janeiro of 1992. Rio Conference 1992. The United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, UNCED, began on 3 June, 1992 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Government officials from 178 countries and between 20,000 and 30,000 individuals from governments, NGOs and the media participated in this event to discuss solutions for global problems such as poverty, the growing gap between industrialized and developing countries, and how to relieve the global environmental system through the introduction of the paradigm of sustainable development. This global forum was necessary because 20 years after the first Earth Summit, some emerging issues have come to the fore, while others remain poignant. The 1972 summit took place in the shadow of the Cold War rivalry between the East and West blocs and their obsessed nuclear arms race. However, after 1972, the world political arena had altered dramatically. The Cold War tensions had relaxed and the increase in awareness of the growing ecological crises such as famine and oil spills, and environmental accidents like the Bhopal and Chernobyl, Oyeshola, 1995, offered an opportunity to persuade nations, both rich and poor, to look beyond national interest and come to some kind of agreement over the management of the degrading state of the world's environment. It is true that countries went to Rio with different perceptions and goals. However, it must be affirmed that the rich industrialized countries of the North had become used to a share of the world's resources, at a rate that was causing an increasing concern about the ecology of the planet and a threat to sustainable development. UNCED did not only seek to revive the cross-sectoral perspective of the Stockholm Conference, but also made explicit the political, organizational and scientific linkages between environmental degradation and economic development. The efforts of intergovernmental and non-governmental organizations, as well as wealthy developed countries to force developing states to alter domestic policies in order to slow the deterioration of the global environment, challenges the sovereign independence of these countries. As a result, arguments sprung up about the success of Rio as people around the world were asking if it had all been worthwhile. As the Earth Summit came to a close on the 14th of June, it ended with more than 100 leaders adopting a Charter for Sustainable Development, together with a new United Nations body to carry out its implementation. At the end of the summit, 152 countries signed the Biodiversity Convention and 150 signed the Climate Change Convention. Other instruments adopted were the Rio Declaration, Agenda 21 and non-binding principles on sustainable development of forest. Among these three non-legally binding instruments that were adopted, the most significant was the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development. The Rio Conference is not an isolated conference. In fact, it is a continuation of previous dialogue of the Brundtland Report of the World Commission on Environment and Development, which was produced under the title of Our Common Future, 1987. The central concern of the report was the increasing globalization of various crises like environment, development and energy and their interrelationships. The report is a landmark in respect of modern thinking about environmental problems and gives prominence to the language of sustainable development that must provide for future generations. However, the report provided little solid guidance on the exact components of what such a duty to future generations might entail. Rather, it called attention to the linkages between economic and environmental considerations and advocated greater use of international financing of environmentally beneficial projects and arrangements under which the debts of developing countries might be traded for commitments to conserve their biodiversity. The primary goals of the summit were to come to an understanding of development that would support socio-economic development and prevent the continued deterioration of the environment and to lay a foundation for a global partnership between the developing and the more industrialized countries based on mutual needs and common interests that would ensure a healthy future for the planet. The UN summit focused on three broad areas captured by the concept and idea of Earth Charter, covering a number of principles. Appendix 11, aiming at development and the protection of the environment. Agenda 21 is intended to be a global action plan for sustainable development and demand of the developing countries from the industrialized countries for a substantial increase in new funding to sustainable development of the South. The conference approved a set of 5 agreements, namely, Agenda 21, the Rio Declaration on Environment and Development, the Statement of Principles on Forests, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Agenda 21 is particularly significant. Agenda 21 included plans for a desertification treaty, a forestry convention and the establishment of a United Nations Sustainable Development Commission, UNSDC, to supervise its implementation. Agenda 21 provided for action at sub-national, local, national and international levels. It created 2 mechanisms for monitoring compliance of states, which was later implemented in follow-up process. One of such mechanisms is the standard UN provision for a follow-up conference in 1997. The other is for national reporting procedures to be implemented and subjected to further examination in a new UN forum on an annual basis through to 1997. Another institution established to promote the implementation of Agenda 21 is the Global Environment Facility, GEF, working in close association with UNEP, UNDP and several UN bodies. Although it was not expected that these institutions could directly implement Agenda 21, neither can it force others to do so, but it was expected to help shape broader international as well as domestic processes in a useful way. The UNSDC consists mainly of 53 representatives from different nations elected for a 3-year term in a manner that ensures equal representation geographically. It began its work in 1993 and has annually met since then to review progress on different aspects of Agenda 21. In a broad sense, the UNSDC process aimed to promote sustainable development in 3 ways. It has a role to promote coordinated approaches towards sustainable development by international agencies. Its second role is to review national reports on aspects of sustainable development, which aims at stimulating governments to review their practices and prepare policies. Government can be called to account for the contents of their policies stated in their reports. The process has been made more substantial with the presence of NGOs. Their third role has been to follow up on unfinished business of the UNCED. One of the other aspects of follow-up to UNCED has been a series of follow-up summit meetings on particular issues such as population and development, Cairo 1994, the role and rights of women, Beijing 1995, and urban development, Istanbul 1996. One significant contribution of these summits is that they have helped to promote political awareness of citizens, groups and concern of NGOs and local authorities. The Global Environment Facility (GEF) was established as a financial mechanism for contributing to the implementation of Agenda 21. The GEF funds amount to some $1 billion, which is so small in comparison to the massive flows of funds that occur through economic transactions globally. Agenda 21 is a remarkable document that contains 400 pages, with 40 chapters aiming at providing a program of action for sustainable development. The chapters consist of a wide range of topics. Their comprehensive nature can be seen from the document's chapter headings. The chapters cover a variety of topics that include promoting sustainable urban development and combating deforestation. Several chapters are on strengthening the role of major groups, including local authorities, trade unions, women, youth etc. At Rio, the industrialized countries, among others, came to solve the issue of climate, forests and endangered species, whereas the developing countries had a different program. The developing countries still face appalling problems related to poverty, and so they insisted that Rio agenda should include development as well as environment. The North argued that it is in the interest of halting climate change that the South should halt deforestation, slow down the consumption of coal and oil, and reduce birth rates. The South argued that the price they receive for their goods in the marketplace is too low, that their debts are intolerable. If all the aid given by the North is subtracted from all the interest that is paid on debt by the South, they end up paying more than they receive, they insisted. Trade and debt have always been, and still are, the basic issues. Unless these problems are addressed, the South does not see how problems such as the destruction of the environment and the growing birth rate, so closely linked to poverty, can be tackled. Richard, 1992, 6. The North was quick to point out the problems of corruption, bad management and dictatorship, as contributory to the problems. The South's response was that the North management of trade and debt issues is the fundamental cause of their ills. The Earth Summit in Rio was inspired and guided by a remarkable document published in 1982 by the Brundtland Commission, which tried to balance the arguments concerning North-South responsibility and suggests ways forward. Intended as a progress report on achievements since the Stockholm Conference 10 years earlier, the impetus for the report came from progressive nations and organizations. The Commission noticed that the problems of environment and the insistence that something be done about them cannot be ignored. In order to arrest these problems, the Commission came out with the term sustainable development. This is described as economic progress which meets all our needs without leaving future generations with fewer resources than the present generation enjoys. It is a way of living from nature's income rather than its capital account. For wealthy nations, sustainable development means policies concerning issues such as recycling, energy efficiency, conservation, rehabilitation of damaged landscapes. Whereas, for the poor countries, it means policies for equity, fairness, respect for the rule of law, redistribution of wealth and wealth creation. Richard, 1992, 16. The central question at the Earth Summit was how to protect the environment and still maintain development. This quest pitted development against developing countries with respect to financial aid and transfers of technology. Industrialized states feared that issues of aid and debt relief would simply take on an environmental label, which would make it more difficult for them to negotiate foreign aid agreements because domestic environmental groups also want their concerns accounted for. Developing states argued that although they supported protection of the environment, they would be unable to implement programs without financial and technical assistance. Stevenson, 2001, 536-537. In spite of its shortcomings, the conference was still a productive one in terms of the various contributions it made. On forest situation, the conference was able to take action on over 100 action proposals for sustainable forest management based on the forest principles adopted in Rio on Intergovernmental Panel on Forests. In relation to the issue of fresh water, the summit made recommendations which it implemented to combat water shortages. As regards climate situation, the summit took action to combat the problem by signing the UN Convention on Climate Change, which was ratified by 166 countries after reaching negotiations to strengthen the commitment. The meeting in Rio de Janeiro symbolized the concerns with the environment and the political issues surrounding sustainable development. The conduct of the summit illustrated the politics of environmental protection. As in Stockholm, preliminary negotiations made it clear that environmental issues can be very political. Rook, 1999, 546. In particular, the North and the South were at odds on many issues. The industrialized world objected to and were able to defeat efforts by the developing countries to force the North to set binding timetables to cut down on the use of fossil fuels and to reduce emissions of carbon dioxide and other gases that contribute to global warming. For its part, the South resisted and
Thanks
was able to
for
defeat
visiting this
destruction of
channel,
the use-
Environmental Tonic. Continue Chapter 3 reading on. 1. Amazon publication. 2. Hard copy of the book. Sustainable Development, Issues and Challenges for Nigeria.